Welcome back to Millside, a truly rural glamping experience. My name is Liz Blount, and today I'm going to be presenting the final session on personnel management. So we're going to be looking in a bit more detail at certain aspects and really thinking about how you can make it work for you. We've talked about all these different models of personnel management, but how can it work for my business? Maybe you think, well, I'm only a small organisation, but a lot of what we're talking about is still relevant for you, and that's what we're going to look at in this session. You might remember in video 1, we talked about the employee life cycle. We've got some separate videos that talk about the recruitment process, so how we attract people, recruit them, and onboard them to the organisation. We've also got some training videos separately to this about development, so you might want to check those out. But for now, we're going to be really thinking about the main stage of somebody's employment with you. So you've recruited them, you've got them on board, they're a regular member of staff. What are we going to do with them? How do we need to treat them? How can we get the best out of that working relationship? And this applies the same whether somebody's only going to be with you for a couple of months as a seasonal worker, or if they're going to be with you, hopefully, for many years. The same principles apply. First of all, it's important to get the basics right. Every employee should have a contract of employment that sets out the terms of their employment, their arrangement with you. And a lot of this is governed by legal and statutory requirements. You also need to have key policies in place. Things like disciplinary, grievance, sickness. These are the key policies that you need to have to govern your relationship with staff. And sometimes organisations put these together in the form of a handbook. I like to think of these as like a skeleton. These are going to provide a secure background underlying everything that you do with your employees. They give you a framework to work to and sets out the key expectations for everyone. Then on top of that, we need to flesh it out to make it work for your organisation. So you need to think about your needs and wants. Not everybody can manage sickness, for example, or offer training and development in the same way. A lot of it will depend on the type of organisation you are, how big you are, how easy it is to release people, how much money you've got to spend, of course. So it's about making it real for you. And you want to think about your values. What's important to you as an organisation? How do you want your employees to feel? That also links into the culture of your organisation. What's important to you? How do you want it to feel working for you? If I asked your employees what's it like to be part of your business, what would they say? One of the things I encourage everyone to do is to build good relationships with their employees. It's things like making sure there's good communication between you. There's support and well-being in place for individuals, and that there's effective management. Don't be afraid to manage your employees. Actually, it works better for everyone if there's clear management lines in place. Communication is one of the most important things that you can do. And again, this applies whether somebody is working with you over a long period of time or whether they're only with you for a short period, perhaps over the summer months. In some ways, if they're there for only a short time, it's even more important that you make the most of the opportunities that you've got. There's formal ways of communicating with people, of course. You might have a system of weekly one-to-ones in place, or maybe annual appraisals. But there's also lots of informal ways of communicating, and they can be really important. It's worth getting to know the individuals working for you and a little bit more about them. That can help you really understand how they're balancing things in their life with what's going on at work. And that way you can come up with better working arrangements for both of you and hopefully head off any problems early on. One of the things you might have heard talked about is something called management by walking about or wandering around. It's a bit of a management jargon, but it does what it says on the tin really. It's worth spending time in your business, just being around, having a look at what interactions are taking place, seeing how people are working. You might become aware of some of the difficult things that are happening, or maybe where there's areas that you need to improve processes, or perhaps where you need to have some conversations with staff to make things run more smoothly. One of the biggest tips that I would give employers is to not put off having difficult conversations. Nobody enjoys having these conversations. If there's an issue perhaps with somebody's sickness and the fact that they're off work a lot, maybe there's problems with their performance and ability at work, or even their conduct. It can be really tempting to let little things go and say, I'll speak to them the next time. But this can land you with problems. So often we get a phone call from someone who's reached the end of their tether and they just want us to help them get rid of a person because they've had enough and they're putting their business at risk. But that can be a really difficult thing to do when we say to them, have you spoken to the person? And they say no. So do try and have these conversations as early as possible. You might be able to nip the problem in the bud. Sometimes you can talk to the person and work out a way for them to change their behaviour or to overcome some of the difficulties. Maybe put extra training in place if it's a problem with their performance. But even if you can't improve the situation and we reach a stage where more formal action has to take place, that's always better if we can show that we've gone through a process with the person, we've had those early conversations and they've had a proper chance to improve the situation before we take any action against them. Make sure that you're following any policies you do have in place. You need to do what you've said you're going to do in your policy. However, it is a balancing act. You need to respond to the individual needs and the situations of the person in front of you. If you've got somebody that's worked for you for 20 years and you've not had any problems and now you've hit a bit of a snag, you're going to need to respond to that differently than maybe someone who's only been with you a few weeks and you're already on the third difficult situation. Your policies are there as a framework and you do need to be consistent, but you need to be fair as well. What we're looking for is for you to provide a reasonable response to the situation. In fact, when cases get as far as employment tribunals, what they consider is a range of reasonable responses. They recognise that it might be different for different organisations, depending on how big you are and the resources that you have. But it's still about thinking, what would a reasonable response to this be? Try and put yourself, if you can, in the shoes of the employee. If you were in that position, how would you like to be dealt with? If you try and do this and think about a measured response, then you'll be in a much better place. Don't be afraid to get help when you need it. People management can be difficult, and just as you would get help in terms of an accountant to help you with your finances, then it's quite reasonable that you might need to get help with some of your HR issues as well. If we think back to the different levels that we talked about earlier, we've got our day-to-day transactions, and you might need someone to help you with the admin processes. Although there's also quite a lot of digital applications that can help with that now as well. You might need help from an HR consultant for things like establishing your policies and managing those tricky situations we've talked about. When it comes to having those difficult conversations, it can be really helpful to have an independent person to come in and help you. And they'll probably have more experience of those situations than you might have. They can also help with developing a strategy and looking at how you might want to use your workforce as part of that going forward. There's also useful information that you can find online. If you go to the gov.uk website, you can find a lot of information on there about your legal requirements as an employer. I'd also recommend having a look at the Acas website. This sets out a lot of information about what is expected of you as an employer, and they have codes of conduct in things like disciplinary and grievance, so you can make sure you're doing what you need to do, and it's a help in building your own policies. The CIPD is a professional organisation for HR professionals, so you might want to have a look at that as well, and there's information for non-members on there. So if this is something you're particularly interested in, take a look. So that's the final session on personnel management. I hope you found it both interesting and useful.